Please continue to eat. But I do recommend or encourage that everyone pay attention to our speaker. We already have a multitude of questions up here, and I do encourage additional questions as well. Like I mentioned, we will have 2 of our youth volunteers walking around with a microphone so that we can answer questions for anyone if they want to raise their hand. Otherwise, please continue to write them on those slips of paper. At this time, I'll go ahead and give the mic over to our speaker, Ustadh Ali. Please go ahead and give him a nice round of applause.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So I have some duplicates here. What is Sharia law? Oh, okay. Not exactly a softballer. Please clear our mind about what we hear in the media about Sharia law. Please discuss Sharia law. Okay, the word Sharia linguistically means a path to cold water. This is what it literally means. Jonathan Brown, professor at Georgetown, he defines Sharia as a process of problem solving. So Sharia is most of the time translated as Islamic law, and I guess you can translate it like that. So a lot of people have sort of this warped idea about what is Sharia. It's kind of one of those words that scare people. A lot of people think it's like some draconian penal system or something that Muslims, the Muslims that want to, reinstitute corporal punishment in the streets of America or something like that. There was an American senator by the name of Santorum who gave a 1-hour lecture on the dangers of Sharia, right? And it was an interesting lecture. I disagreed with almost everything he said. But there was a 20-year-old, 21-year-old Muslim who was there who approached him after the lecture. And he said to him, Mr. Santorum, thank you for the lecture. Can you tell me what are the 5 maqasid of Sharia? So what are the 5 aims of the Sharia? So this is like basic, like first grade level. And he just said, I don't know. That's like the equivalent of me doing this like massive deconstructionist critique of Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, and then a Christian stands up in the audience and says, excuse me, sir, what are the 4 Gospels? And then I go, John, George, Paul, and Ringo? So Sharia is an indispensable part of a Muslim's identity. When a Muslim wakes up and makes his water ablutions or lustrations, that's the old Catholic word, lustrations, and prays, he's following Sharia. When a Muslim gives charity, he follows Sharia. When a Muslim is fasting, he's following Sharia. So it's an indispensable part of a Muslim's identity. So this idea of pushing out Sharia is really sort of a veiled way of saying, let's not have any more Muslims, because a Muslim without following Sharia is not a Muslim. And I think it really comes down to fundamental misunderstanding of what Sharia is. Sharia is also extremely vast. There are some immutables, right, that don't change. These are called thawabit in Arabic. But the vast majority of Sharia is mutaghayyarat. They're variables. They change. So people say, do you believe in the Sharia? Whose interpretation? Right? You put 5 imams in one room, you get 10 different opinions. If you go to the country of my birth, Iran, most of, and obviously these countries are not perfect, but most of the students in the university are female. The majority of physicians are female. And in Iran, and if you ask them, why is this so? They'll say, this is because of the Sharia. Now, if you go across the border into places in Afghanistan, women do not leave their homes ever. And if you ask them, why are you doing this? They'll say, well, this is a Sharia. So you have massive, massive divergent opinions of what this actually is, right? You have Jewish communities in America that follow halakha law. That's the equivalent of Sharia. They actually almost have the same meaning. Halak means a way of going. Sharia, a way to cold water, right? But here's something interesting about the Sharia. If there's something in the Sharia, if a Muslim is living in a non-Muslim majority land, and there's something in Muslim Sharia that contradicts the law of that land, he must abandon the Sharia and adopt and adhere to the law of that land, and by doing so, he's actually adhering to the Sharia. So that's a very important point to make, right? That there can be no conflict between the Constitution of the United States and the Sharia. So trying to push out the Sharia, right, which is a concerted effort, and I think, again, most of the people that are sort of proposing this legislation, they don't really know what it is. They think it's, again, like corporal punishment in the streets, right? That's sort of the warped perception of it. But this idea of let's get rid of Sharia, that in and of itself is unconstitutional. Because to get rid of Sharia means to get rid of Muslims, and that's not America. So the short answer again is that, thank you. There isn't one version of Sharia. It's not some law code that was codified 1,400 years ago and here it is, take it or leave it. It's a living, dynamic law, just like American law. Things change over time. Many things change over time. That's the point of having a Congress, to make laws, propose laws. Things change, right? It used to be in America that, the mentally retarded were sterilized. And now that's not done anymore. It used to be that people owned slaves. This is very important to understand. The nature of societal law is that it's dynamic and changing, and people forget that sometimes. Okay. What would you say? Here's another softball, I guess. Not really. What would you say to a radical Muslim as to how their interpretation of the Quran can be so different? What's interesting is if you look into the hadith literature of the Prophet, he prophesized that within this ummah, this nation, there's always going to be this fringe element. And he always described them as like foolish little boys, right? And he said that when they recite the Quran, it doesn't pass their throat, meaning it doesn't penetrate their heart, which some scholars interpret as they don't really know what it means, right? So one of my scholars, an eminent sheikh, he said, about radical Muslims or these ISIS type people. He said they know what God said, but they don't know why he said it. And that's all context. I tell my students the first 3 rules of real estate are location, location, location. The first 3 rules of dinner is kebab, kebab, kebab. And the first 3 rules of scriptural hermeneutics and interpretation is context, context, context. So if someone doesn't have requisite knowledge, that's the whole point of the oral law in Judaism, is to check someone's interpretation. If somebody can memorize the Torah, you might think, well, this person's a rabbi. Then you ask him something from the Mishnah he doesn't know, he doesn't have transmissional knowledge. Knowledge has to be transmissional. You have to study with someone who studied 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 with a companion of the Prophet, who studied with the Prophet, who learned from Gabriel, or learned from God. So transmissional knowledge is very, very important. So, and this, is important because it weeds out these sort of charlatans or freelance sort of scholars who like to give, legal rulings and, he's an accountant. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you interpreting the Quran in such ways when you don't have requisite knowledge, don't even understand Arabic? Context is very important. And I'll tell you a story, it's a quick story. I always tell this story. I have to tell it again. I was at a church one time, and we were having a beautiful interfaith dialogue. And there's so many questions. Whew. Okay, and then I walked out of the church, and there was another church there who did not like the idea that I was inside of a church. So they said, what are you doing in a church? You're a Muslim. I said, we're having a dialogue. They said, you're not allowed in a church. And then one of them, it was an older lady, she had a Bible, and she came up to me and she said, why did your prophet go into Europe and slaughter the Europeans? I said, what? I don't know what you're talking about. She said, no, it's very well documented. I said, no, I don't know what you're talking about. He never went to Europe. Who's my prophet? Napoleon? And then she said, and then she quoted a verse from the Quran, right? Out of context, right? It's like, attack the unbelievers wherever you find them. There's a verse that says that, So in order for me to I said, this verse has a context. Right? And she said, no, that's what you have to do. You have to kill all unbelievers. So I said to her, do you think that I think that? She said, yeah. I said, should I kill you now or later? And it kind of confused her a little bit. And she said, Oh, I don't know. I didn't think about that. And so in order to sort of demonstrate her faulty methodology, I quoted a verse from the Bible out of context. So I said, and I quoted the New Testament. Because you quote Old Testament, sometimes they go, that's been abrogated, so on and so forth. So New Testament, Luke 19:27. And I quoted from the King James Version, and it went something like this: those enemies of mine that do not wish me to reign over them, bring them hither and slay them before me. And then she went, what? Hither, slay? What does that mean? So, okay, I gotta bring it down a notch here. So I had memorized this verse because my dad wanted to read the Bible. So I gave him like a King James or like an Oxford Study Bible. And he's like, I don't know what this is, what's going on here. Is this English? So I gave him the Berenstain Bear translation. There's a Bible for children. It's called the Berenstain Bear translation. Very simple English. I didn't tell him it was for children. So I gave him, kind of covered, the bears on the cover. But there's pictures on the inside. Anyway, so it said something to the effect of, whoever does not want me to be a king over them, cut their throats in my very presence. Luke 19:27. And then I expected her to say, oh, you're taking it out of context. And then I would say, aha, very good. Lesson learned. But she said, it's not in the Bible. So I said, can I see the Bible? She had a Bible. So I showed her the verse, and then she looked at the cover like I switched it. And then she closed it, and she looked at me, and she smiled, and she said, I know who you are, Satan. Yeah. A former prime minister of Israel said that the only way ISIS will be defeated is if Muslims defeat it. Do you agree? Yes, I agree. If so, how can Muslims defeat it? So here's the thing. A lot of non-Muslims ask me, why aren't people like you out shouting from the hilltops and, condemning ISIS? How many people here have Googled Muslims who condemn ISIS? Muslims who condemn ISIS. How many times have you guys Googled that? You'll find a whole... So here's the thing. I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist. I am a little bit. But the media has an agenda. Of course they do. They need ratings, right? So there's a book out called Refuting ISIS. It's a beautiful book done by a Syrian scholar. It's been translated. There's something called An Open Letter to Baghdadi. The leader of ISIS is this man who calls himself Baghdadi, right? And it has 120 signatories of some of the most eminent scholars in the world who have sway over millions of Muslims, tens of millions of Muslims. You have 700,000 Muslim scholars and students in India who signed a petition who denounced ISIS. So, we go into the mosque and they're actually Muslims telling me, stop talking and condemning ISIS so much. Let's talk about something else already. So we're actually tired of hearing it, but non-Muslims haven't heard anything. So what's happening? So, the Prophet, again, he said that this group, they were in the caliphate of Ali, the fourth caliph. They were amongst the Umayyad dynasty. They were in the Abbasid, they were in the Ottoman Empire. There's always going to be, when you have a religion that's 1 out of 5 human beings, it's inevitable that you're going to have this element, right? Somebody asked a question, I don't know if it's in here, but what percentage of Muslims are radical? It depends on your definition of radical. Because I'm radical, dude. No, because gnarly. Because some Muslims believe that if you pray 5 times a day, you're a radical. But if you mean like ISIS type radical, it's less than 1% of 1%. I've never met in my life a radical Muslim. I've lived in the Middle East. I've traveled all throughout North Africa, Arabian Peninsula. I've never met of course they're out there, of course. And I've met thousands upon thousands of Muslims. I teach all the time, I travel the world, but obviously they're out there. But I think what's happening with, again, the media is that this element is aggrandized oftentimes and make it seem like this is a real threat and that your next door neighbor might be some secret cell who's really trying to kill you. Oh, interesting. So I don't necessarily blame people for having this perception. If all I knew about Islam was what I learned from mainstream media, I don't want to, name any names, CNN, Fox, I would probably revile this religion, to be perfectly honest with you. I have a PhD in Islam, and when I hear people on these channels talk about Islam, I have no idea what they're talking about. So how do you discern? God be with you. 20,000 people in America become Muslim every year. And people say, oh, that's because it's spread by the sword. Okay, really? Do I have a sword? I fired a gun once. I went to a shooting range. It was a Glock 9mm. It was like 20 feet away. I was like 0 for 6, and I just went, okay, that's enough of that. Yeah. What else did I want to say about that? So again, the guiding lesson here is actually speak to Muslims, right? Speak to Muslims. I know a lot of Muslims who have never spoken to a Christian, but they have a whole lot to say about Christianity, a whole lot to say about Christians. I have a Muslim friend who lives in Iraq, who is the husband of my wife's Arabic teacher. I speak to him through Skype, and he says, there's American soldiers right around the corner over here. They're going to slaughter all of us. This is his perception of America. And then he tells me, are you safe in America? How many times have they tried to kill you? How many times never. How many times have you been struck by a Christian? Never. How many times has he insulted you? Once or twice. But so has my cousin. More than that. This is their skewed perception, right? Okay. Why are men and women separated at prayer? Aha. So, according to our, I don't know what to call it, anthropology, God made men and women differently. So Muslims would not affirm gender fluidity. Men and women are different. They think differently, they act differently, they're physically different. There is such a thing called biological gender. And so God made men very visual. So I don't know if I should use this example, but every man remembers very vividly the first piece of pornography he ever saw. It's right there. Not me, of course. It's right there. You could have been in 5th grade. It's right there. So men are very, very visual. So in the mosque, at least in the mosque, it doesn't mean women are worse than men or something. It actually means women might be actually better than men because women aren't distracted in prayer like men are. Men tend to be more distracted in prayer. So during the prayer, men just need to focus completely on the prayer, right? And not think about anything else. Because the rationale is a woman in genuflection is a distraction, and I agree. I tend to agree with that. So that's the reason for that. And if you go to like an Orthodox synagogue, women are behind the men, or they're upstairs. So it's the same rationale there as well. Yeah. How does Islam deal with atheism? And is atheism considered shirk? Shirk means idolatry. Well, my understanding of the Quran is that the Quran does not affirm atheism. My understanding of the Quran is that the Quran is saying everybody actually worships something. Whatever takes most priority in your life is what you worship, and it is your God. There's a verse in the Quran that says, أَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهَا. Have you seen that certain one who takes his own caprice and desires as his God? Right? So even if somebody says, well, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in a personal God. The definition of theism, according to the Quran, is whatever takes precedence in your life, that is your God. So people worship wealth, people worship their egos, people they compare followers on Facebook. I have more followers than you. There's this guy who says, how many believers do I have? You know what I'm talking about, right? The believers. It's like, what? Strange. So everyone worships. So with atheism, this idea and nobody really believes this anymore, but the steady state model that the universe is pre-eternal in the past, right? That's the definition of shirk or idolatry. So you're ascribing to nature or the universe a divine quality of essential pre-eternality. That only belongs to God. So that's in partnering with God. That's not really no belief in God. You're giving a divine quality to nature. So you're worshiping nature. Or that the universe just sort of caused itself to come out of nothing. The universe came out of nothing, causing itself. So creating something from nothing is what God does, creation ex nihilo. So again, this is not really atheism. This is ascribing a divine quality to the universe itself. And another way of looking at atheism, atheism technically means belief in a non-personal God, right? Theism means belief in a personal God, atheism, non-personal God. And then deism, oftentimes people characterize Islam as being a deistic tradition. Deistic in the sense of like the Platonic God or Aristotelian God, that God created everything, but God doesn't really care about us. He doesn't reach out to us. He's kind of a absentee landlord. He just, we can do whatever we want, never collects the rent. So that's not correct. So in Islam, God is immanent. He's transcendent in the sense of physicality. So Muslims don't confirm, for example, divine incarnation. God doesn't incarnate, and that's something that Muslims and Jews have in common, right? In Hosea 11:9, it says, "Ki el anochi velo ish." Indeed, I am God and not a man. Lo ish el, 23:19 Numbers. God is not a man. God does not dwell in his creation. The first few commandments of Exodus chapter 20, it says, they're theological, that you shall not make unto thyself the image or the likeness of anything in the heavens above or in the oceans below or on the earth. I'm a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the, so on and so forth, right? However, God is also immanent in the sense that his love and mercy are close to us. So there's a verse in the Quran that says, وَنَحْنُ أَقْرَبُ إِلَيْهِ مِنْ حَبْلِ الْوَرِيدِ. We, royal plural, are closer to the human being than his jugular vein, an internal organ. So God is very close. God is someone who is personal in Islam. So when we pray, you saw our prayers, those are our canonical prayers. Those are done in Arabic, right? But the Prophet said, ad-du'a mukhul ibadah. He said supplication is the bone marrow or the essence of worship. Is when you isolate yourself, you put your hands up and you speak to God in a language you understand, because most Muslims, I would say, don't understand classical Arabic. Even maybe most Arabs don't understand classical Arabic. But this is what we have to do. This is our canonical prayer, right? But the essence of prayer is pouring your heart out to God. And this is very important to mention. How much time do I have? It's 10 to 8. 8:10. Whoa. So these are kind of duplicates here. What is the difference between Sunni and Shia? Okay. I'm going to go a little bit quicker here because there's so many questions, and then we're going to have an open mic. So, difference between Sunni and Shia. The main difference is political theology, as we heard. Political theology. This is the origin of the difference. The origin is who succeeds the Prophet. The Shia position is a descendant of the Prophet. Someone from the family of the Prophet will be the rightful caliph, right? The Sunni position is there has to be some sort of mutual consultation, some sort of governing body or oligarchy or democracy. The Quran doesn't mandate any form of government. The Quran does not say, thou shalt have a theocracy or plutocracy or democracy. No, the only thing the Quran says from a political standpoint was, وَأَمْرُهُمْ شُرَى بَيْنَهُمْ. Let their political affairs be conducted with some sort of mutual consultation. So it's not just one man saying, this is what we're going to do, and shut your mouths. There's some sort of mutual consultation. So that's the main difference, is political theology. Now, over time, you do have theological differences that have crystallized, right? However, the vast majority of Sunnis will not anathematize the Shia. then they won't say, well, they're not Muslim, because the theological differences are negligible. For example, the Shia, at least the 12 are Shia, and there's different types of Shia. You have the 5 Imam Shia, the 7 Imam Shia. They're called Ismailis. The 5 Imams are called the Zaydis. The 12 are the most prominent, Ithna Ashariya, the 12 Imams. They believe that there's 12 descendants of the prophets, of the Prophet Muhammad, that are all infallible. Sunnis don't believe that, although Sunnis believe that those Imams are great men. They would only ascribe infallibility to prophets, not to Imams. So there's a difference there. There's also jurisprudential differences, right? So for example, Shia, they tend to combine prayers, even when they're not traveling, right? And Shia also will tend to wipe over their bare feet during the water ablutions, which is not permissible in all 4 schools of the Sunnis. So there's jurisprudential differences. But even amongst the Sunnis, there are jurisprudential differences. Even within one school of Sunni orthodoxy, like the Hanafi school, there are various opinions, but those opinions are deemed to be negligible. They don't anathematize anyone. There are fringe elements of the Shia that do say, oh, these Sunnis are not really Muslims. And you have fringe elements from the Sunnis that say, these Shia are not really Muslims. ISIS does not discriminate. Everyone is an unbeliever except for us. That's their position. Why do some women wear a hijab and some don't? You would have to, these questions that I hesitate to answer these questions, because a sister should really answer this question. But I will say something. And I'm not considering myself gender fluid right now. I would say that all 4 schools of Islamic law in the Sunni orthodoxy, as well as the Ja'fari school, which is the Shia school, they mandate a dress code, right? And the dress code is that men and women have to dress modestly, right? But again, since God made women so beautiful, they have to do a little bit extra. So they have to wear a hijab. They have to cover their hair and their neck. There's different opinion about the face. There's different opinion about the top of the foot. And there's allowance for the forearm, right? So some women choose to do it and some don't, and we're not to be judgmental. Islam teaches us that everyone is in a state of sin. Everybody is in a state of sin. The Prophet said, "Kullu bani Adam khata'un." All of the children of Adam are in a state of sin, but the best of those who are in a state of sin are those who make tawbah, teshuvah, repentance. So we should not judge people by outward appearance. There's a hadith of a man who came into the Prophet's mosque. And he walked in and he had a turban on, he had a long beard. He had a mark on his forehead from the excessive prostrations. And the companions of the Prophet saw this man and started singing his praises. And the Prophet looked at him and said, "I see something from Satan in his face. There's something satanic in his face." And the companion said, "Whoa, what do you mean?" And the Prophet asked him, he said, "I'm going to ask you a question. Answer it in truth. When you walked into this gathering, did you think you were the best man in this gathering?" And he said, "Allahumma na'am." He said, "Yes, I thought I was the best man." Right? So it's extremely important that, I didn't get to this in my talk earlier, but I was talking about 3 dimensions of our religion. One is Islam, the practice aspect. One is Iman, the faith aspect. And the third one is called Ihsan, which is the character or relational, transcendental aspect. And that this is extremely important, and oftentimes this element is lacking amongst Muslims. That good character, right? There's a hadith that says, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ. Like, adorn yourself with the qualities or characteristics of God. Be lordly, be divine. Kunu rabbaniyin. Just as God is merciful and forbearing, you should mirror that. This is called mystical union, and this is found in Catholic tradition. This is found in Eastern Orthodoxy. This is found in Islam. It's found in Judaism. Islam, Catholicism, and Eastern Orthodoxy, they actually have the same 3 steps The first step to mystical union, or having, quote unquote, divine character, aligning yourself with God's will, is what Catholics call via purgativa, to purge oneself of vice. This is extremely important, that people have vices. And it's very easy just to be complacent, to be satisfied with oneself because I pray 5 times a day, I'm good enough. Well, Imam al-Ghazali says those people are formalists. There's too much stock on the outward. Think about Matthew 23, the 7 woes. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees. We have to be fair, not all Pharisees, right? Nicodemus was a Pharisee. Joseph of Arimathea was a Pharisee. There's other Pharisees that apparently defended Jesus. Generally speaking, to this group that's hostile to him, he says, you've overlooked the weightier demands of the law, justice, mercy, and good faith. You strain at the gnat and you swallow the camel. Ye whited sepulchres, on the outside you are clean, on the inside you reek of death. Too much emphasis on the outer, the exoteric, nothing on the esoteric. The Prophet Muhammad said, the weightiest thing on the scales on the day of judgment is good character. Good character, right? So via purgativa, the Eastern Orthodox call that catharsis, from the Greek to cleanse something. In Islam, it's called takhliya, an emptying out, a kenosis, to get rid of vice. How do you get rid of vice? So Imam al-Ghazali, who's the Aquinas of Islam, the Maimonides of Islam, Imam al-Ghazali, he says you have to sit with the spiritual masters, and you have to habituate your tongue and your heart with God's remembrance. Then you get to the second step, which is called via contemplativa, or theoria in Greek, or tahliya. It's when you ornament the lower self with a virtue. And Islam's virtue theory is very Aristotelian. It espouses habitus, that if you want a good virtue, you have to fake it until you make it. If you want to be patient, you have to pretend when something happens. You have to force yourself to be patient until it's woven into your very nature. Usually happens after 40 days, according to Muslim ethicists, if you're doing it right. Right? There was a story of there was a woman at the graveyard in Medina, and she was wailing and she was screaming, she was hitting herself, ripping her clothes. So the Prophet approached her and he said, Ya amatallah, wasbiri wattaqi, O maidservant of God, be patient and fear God. And without even turning around, she said, Ilayka anni, get away from me. You've never been afflicted like this. This was my son. My son died. And the Prophet Muhammad buried 6 of his 7 children. But there's no rejoinder from him. He's not debating her. So he just goes home. And then the companions of the Prophet said to her, you know who that was? And she said, who, one of you? And then they said, no, that was the Prophet. So she goes and waits by his door. And the Prophet comes out, and then she says, okay, now I'll be patient. And the Prophet said, إِنَّمَا الصَّبْرُ فِي صَدْمَةُ الْأُولَى. He said, true patience is when the affliction first hits. That's true patience. That's what you have to strive for. So, you don't lose your mind, start kicking and punching people, throw things across the room, and then you sit down because you're so tired to go, okay, I'll be patient. That's not patience. So this is a training regimen, right? And then the third step, mystical union, is called via illuminativa, or theosis, or tajalliya. All right. Oh, this is a good question. I'm glad this gentleman brought this question. Do the oldest existing copies of the Quran support the idea that all the texts are the same, or are there actual textual differences? There are textual differences. Okay, so if you look, for example, at early manuscripts attributed to companions of the Prophet, there are minor differences in those manuscripts. Now, Islamic theologians have theological responses or explanations for those differences. For example, there's a hadith in Bukhari, which is a strong book of hadith, and some consider it multiply attested, that the Quran was actually revealed in 7 dialects of Arabic. That the Quran was actually revealed in 7 dialects. So the Prophet is Qurayshi, that's his tribe. But there are numerous other tribes around him who speak a slightly different dialect of Arabic. So in order to facilitate the understanding of many of the Arabs in that region, the Prophet was given a dispensation to recite the Quran in their dialect. And sometimes this means changing a word or two. Right? So those manuscripts bear witness to that fact. But I would say generally there's no major difference. I mean, you're not going to come across, a new chapter of the Quran that wasn't there. And no, the differences primarily are of orthography, spelling conventions, and a few synonyms here and there, right? And some voweling differences. For example, one recitation, and both of them are valid in prayer. One recitation of the opening Fatiha, which was recited, is Maliki Yawmiddin, which means owner of the day of judgment. And others recite that Maliki Yawmiddin with no alif, so king of the day of judgment. Both are considered to be valid recitations. They're slightly different. But overall, I would say the textual integrity of the Quran, and I would even say the Bible itself, is better than most people think. At prayer time, do you say the same prayer, or can you make up your own? Well, if you're praying in a congregation, basically you are, again, there's a difference in, basically you stay quiet and the imam will lead the prayer for you, right? But if you're praying by yourself, you recite Al-Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran, and then you'll recite some 3 or 5 other verses from the Quran, whatever you want to recite from the Quran. So you have to know a little bit of Quran to recite. You go back 100 years, almost every Catholic knew some Latin, right? So Muslims are like that. If you go to Pakistan or Iran, non-Arab countries, everyone knows a little bit of Arabic because they have to know how to pray, right? But again, supplication can be done in your own language at any time. You don't need to be in a state of ritual purity. You could be driving in your car. You can be laying in bed. Supplication is something that you can do at any time. What can you say to those who are terrified of Islam? How do we educate them that Muslims are not all extremists? By putting this program on CNN. But will it happen? I always encourage Muslims to, and I think right now there's a trend of, dare I say, distrust of MSM, of mainstream media. That's why there's a lot of interest in alternative media outlet on the internet, because people want to know what's really happening in the world, and they're just not trusting what people like CNN are saying, because apparently they got the entire election wrong, and people are just stupefied by that. And people were saying on these channels, MSNBC and CNN and Fox News, that there's no way possible Trump could win. It's just not possible, right? So I think people are, that's why if you go to YouTube, you'll see people who are political commentators, whether they're conservative or liberal, who have thousands and thousands of followers, because that's where the news is coming from now. And I think there's also a concerted effort from mainstream media to paint those news outlets as fake news now. We're not fake, you're fake. So I just say, let the best people win. As for the corruption taught or thought concerning the New Testament, where does this congregation stand with the majority or minority position? I don't think there's an official position of this congregation. I think you'd have to ask individual Muslims. But I would say, because my dissertation was on this, the vast majority of Muslims will say the Bible, we're talking about the New Testament is corrupt in its text. The text has changed, and it's corrupt beyond repair. That's the dominant opinion. That's not the opinion I follow, by the way. The opinion I follow is I think the Quran is saying, because there's multiple intertextual allusions to the New Testament in the Quran. The Quran calls Jesus the Word of God. No other Christian text that's canonical mentions that. no other gospel that's canonical except the Gospel of John. If you read the Gospel of John on its surface, as a Muslim, you'd be like, whoa, this can't be true. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Come on, that can't be true, right? I think there's a different way of reading these things. So Imam al-Ghazali, Imam al-Biqai, Fakhruddin al-Razi, I mean, these are major, big-time scholars. They held the opinion that the New Testament text is sound. The text is sound, but the so-called corruption that creeps into Christianity is from post-apostolic exegesis of these texts that viewed these texts through a very Greek lens and introduced these terms that are not biblical, like homoousios, right, that co-substantial, the Father and the Son are co-substantial. They would say that that's where so very early on, it's very clear that there were two distinct sort of interpretations of the message of Christ. You have Hellenistic Christianity and you have Judaic Christianity. And the book of James and Jude represent Judaic Christianity. And the other books that represent Judeo-Christianity are not in the New Testament because that form of Christianity did not win the day, as it were. And the definitive canon of the New Testament was, the first bishop to name the present 27 books was Athanasius, and that was in 367 of the Common Era, so long after Constantine had converted. So I think there's truth in other books that are not in the canon, that represent more a Judaic Christianity. All right. Forgiveness is granted and looks different for religions. If it is by grace for Islam, when does that happen and how does one know? So Muslims believe, I think I left this thing up in the air too, one of the 6 articles of faith is belief in the day of judgment. All right, so Muslims believe in the day of judgment. God will judge all and God will send human beings to one of 2 places according to their heart and deeds. So we're taught by, so nobody has personal assurance. I mean, there is a hadith of the Prophet where he says, whoever says there's no God but Allah and that I am his messenger with sincerity will enter paradise. But it's not a personal guarantee. I mean, the Prophet didn't say, Ali from California, he will enter paradise. So we're taught to have hope in God, to have a good opinion of God. And when I mentioned earlier about hope and fear, it seems like from a sort of understanding of the text that there should be a little more leaning on hope. Sorry, wearing the 2 sandals, but you're sort of leaning more on more hope in God than fear, because everyone's a shortcomer. So the Prophet said, have a good opinion of God. Have a good opinion of God. So what is shirk? And is it the unforgivable sin? Yes, shirk is association with God, worshiping other than God or associating partners with God. It is considered the unforgivable sin if repentance is not made. However, Muslims are not allowed, it's actually impermissible, it's haram for a Muslim to consign anyone to hell. I cannot say to anyone, you're going to go to hell. It's impermissible according to Islam. I've been consigned to the flames of hell many, many times by different people. But I cannot return the favor, all right, as it were. So, and that's because God is the changer of hearts. And then people have traumatic lives. We don't know what people have gone through. There are people who are abused as children. You don't know what they've gone through, right? So, to judge someone, I mean, according to Imam al-Ghazali, in order for someone it's very difficult for someone to go to hell. And they don't go to hell on a technicality. It's like, oh, I was born in India in the year 522, and I worship Ganesha and Krishna, so I guess I'm going to hell, right? No one goes to hell on a technicality, right? It's interesting, the Prophet said that the flesh of martyrs does not decompose, that God, he preserves them, they're incorruptible. You go to places in the world that Catholic saints are buried, or they're not actually buried, they're in open air tombs, they're not decomposing. And that's something for the Muslim to think about, When they exhumed Medgar Evers' body in 1993, 30 years after he was shot by a Klansman on his driveway, his body was in pristine shape, pristine condition. There's something for a Muslim to think about. God will be merciful even if we don't want him to be. We are not God. God is the most merciful of those who show mercy. God knows everything about us. How can we possibly judge someone and consign them to the flames? We don't know what that person's been through. How do Muslims consider what is the kingdom of God, and what's their belief regarding this? So there, again, there's no, the expression Malkutha da Allah, as I said in Syriac, is a biblical expression. It's not necessarily mentioned in the Quran. There's something similar that seems to be talking about paradise. But if you look at, for example, Genesis 49:10, Jacob says to his sons, he says, the scepter should not pass from Judah. The scepter, the king's scepter should not pass from Judah. Or the law from between his feet, until the coming of Shiloh, and unto him shall the obedience of the nations be. So it seems like here, the king's scepter represents prophecy. Right? Prophecy, that the Shiloh, whoever that is, Christian exegetes believe it to be Jesus Christ, will come from Judah with the scepter. Some say this means kingship or messiahship. Jesus says in Matthew, the kingdom of God shall be taken away from you and given to the nation, a nation that bears the proper fruit. So again, it seems like here he's talking about prophecy. But there's no official Islamic, that's a biblical term. So I think it means prophecy, but that's my own opinion. Yes, 5 minutes, sorry. Where do imams receive their training? Hopefully from another imam who has teaching certificates, right? One of the things about the Apostle Paul that is problematic from a Muslim perspective is that Paul tends to take a weakness and turn it into a strength. So in one of his letters, Paul, he says, I don't have letters of recommendation. I had my vision. I had an apocalypsis of Christ. So the subtext there, according to New Testament scholars, is that you have Jerusalem apostles coming into lands like Galatia, where Paul was evangelizing and correcting Paul's deviant teachings. Paul calls that teaching heteros evangelion, another gospel, right? So what does he mean, letters of recommendation? It seems like these apostles from Jerusalem, they have some sort of letter, some sort of teaching license from James. James is the brother of Christ, whatever that means, probably first cousin of Jesus, who is the leader of the Jerusalem episcopate, right? In Gospel of Thomas, Logion number 12, Jesus says, when I'm gone, you must go to James the just, Yaakov HaTzadik, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. Very interesting statement. So Paul is saying, well, I don't need a teaching license. I had my apocalypsis. So an imam who comes to us and says, well, who did you study with? And he says, nobody. I had an apocalypsis. He doesn't have permission to teach the Quran or nothing. He needs to, even if he did have an apocalypsis, he needs to produce his credentials, right? If somebody wants to operate on me, open heart surgery, and he says, I said, do you have an MD? I had a dream last night, and I was taught the finer points of vascular surgery. That might be true. Maybe it was, but I'm not going to accept that. When Jesus comes into, and Jesus is an exception because Jesus, he's a prophet and he demonstrated his prophecy, at least according to the Muslim position. When Jesus comes into Jerusalem, the Pharisees ask him, under whose authority are you doing these things, right? They want to know, who's your rabbi? And then Jesus, he doesn't give answers very readily, right? He wants you to think. So he says, John the Baptist, is he from God or not? And they said, we don't know. Then he said, then I'm not going to tell you on whose authority I'm doing these things. A way of sort of getting out of the trap. Should we pay these taxes to Caesar? Whose image is this? Caesar. Render unto Caesar. and render unto God what is God's. It's a brilliant answer. How will the current administration, I think it's the last one, and then inshallah. How will the current administration affect U.S. or us and Muslim relations? I guess it means us or U.S. I don't know. Affect us and Muslim relations. You know, a lot of young people, they're almost, it's almost like they're panicking right now. And it's because all they've known is Obama, basically, right? So they don't, I always calm them down. I say, you know, I remember the Bush years. I remember 9/11. I remember the Patriot Act. I remember, you know, Guantanamo Bay. You know, these things, you know, they come in cycles. The world is ebb and flow. You know, Muslims aren't, you know, sort of neo-Marxist. We don't believe that perfect justice will ever be established in the world. I mean, we should always strive for justice. You know, the word Muslim is an active participle, not passive. The passive is Muslim. Muslim means I'm going to sit back and say, help me, Lord, and I do nothing. But a Muslim is someone who's actively doing something. And the Prophet said in a hadith, if the end of time should come upon you and you're planting a seed, finish planting the seed. You're never going to see the tree. The point is, just keep doing what you have to do. But perfect justice will never be manifested in the world. Perfect justice, that's why there's a day of judgment, right? So we have to do our best. We shouldn't be alarmist, right? I think the American civic infrastructure is set up so that one man cannot have absolute power. You know, he's going to try to do things, and you know his ban was repealed, and he's trying to rewrite it and things. So those nets are there. So we shouldn't be alarmist. It's a good system. It's a very good system. And what's also great about the system is, you know, in 4 years or 8 years, there's going to be somebody else, and you know, so unless something crazy happens, I always tell. As a joke, I always say, you know, in the Quran, one of the major signs of the end of time is the blowing of the trump. You know, so it's a good day. The Prophet said the affair of the believer is always good. When he's in a state of hardship, he couples his hardship with patience. When he's in a state of prosperity, he couples his prosperity with gratitude. It's all good.
All right, guys, let's have another round of applause, alhamdulillah, for our great speaker tonight. Thanks so much.
I added that last line for another round of applause.